Every expert failed to save the dying cornfield. One old farmer revived it in a season. The field started dying in the summer of 1987. Not all at once, in patches. Harlan Meese noticed it in July, walking the rows the way he always did, early in the morning before the heat built up. He was 67 years old, had been farming the same 140 acres in Boone County, Indiana, since 1954. 33 years on the same ground. He knew what a sick field looked like. This one was sick. The corn in the northeast corner had gone pale. Not yellow the way nitrogen-starved corn goes yellow, streaked and ragged down the leaf. This was a gray-white pallor, like the color had drained out from the inside. Stalks standing, but hollow-looking. The ears, where they'd formed at all, were light. Too light. Harlan pulled one from a stalk and peeled it back. 30% fill, maybe 40. He counted the affected rows. 14 of them, 60 yards wide. He stood there in the morning heat with the pulled ear in his hand and looked at it for a long time. Then he walked back to the barn. The field had produced 118 bushels per acre the year before. That was 1986. Average for Boone County was 112. Harlan had been above average for 11 of the last 15 years. The northeast corner alone was supposed to produce enough to pay for the seed and the diesel and have something left over. He called the county extension office on a Tuesday morning in late July. A man named Douglas Farr came out the following Thursday. Farr had been with the Purdue Extension Service for 9 years. He walked the affected rows with a clipboard. He pulled soil samples with a probe. He looked at the ears Harlan had already pulled and laid out on the tailgate of the truck. He made notes for 25 minutes. Farr said it looked like a fungal issue. Possibly gray leaf spot, possibly something else interacting with gray leaf spot. He recommended a fungicide application. Headline brand, 6.6 fluid ounces per acre. Applied as soon as possible. He said the infected area might not recover fully this season, but the treatment would prevent spread. Harlan asked what had caused it. Farr said the wet spring had created conditions, the humidity. He said this kind of thing happened and left it at that. He charged nothing for the visit. That was part of the extension service. Harlan bought the headline. $38 per acre applied at the co-op's rate, covering the 14-row section plus a 20-row buffer. He pulled the call on a Monday in early August. Applied it himself with the sprayer he'd used for 11 years, a 500-gallon pull-behind with the John Deere 4430. 3 weeks later, the pale sections hadn't recovered. The buffer zone had started to show the same gray-white color. 4 more rows, then 6. By the 1st of September, the affected area had grown to 31 rows, and the fungicide hadn't slowed it. The ears were filling at less than half weight. The corn was standing, but it was empty. Farr came back out. He looked at the expanded damage and wrote more notes. He said the pathogen might be resistant to the azoxystrobin in the headline. He recommended switching to a triazole-based product, Stratego YLD. He said the fall application might arrest what was left of the season and set up the following year for better results. Harlan bought the Stratego, another $31 per acre for the expanded 31-row section plus new buffer. He applied it the second week of September. By harvest in October, 47 rows were affected. Total yield from that section, 31 bushels per acre, less than a third of the 1986 number. The rest of the field came in at 109. The field average dropped to 89 bushels per acre. Harlan lost $4,200 in revenue on the affected rows compared to the prior year. That was before counting the cost of the 2 fungicide applications. $2,400 in product alone. He put the numbers in the ledger book he kept in the kitchen drawer, wrote them down the way he wrote everything down, The total loss for the season against expected return, $6,800. He didn't talk about it much. His neighbor to the east, a man named Kurt Albro, had noticed the gray patches from his own field. Harlan heard from his wife, Helen, that Kurt was telling people at the Jamestown elevator that Harlan had a soil problem. Not a disease problem, a soil problem, the kind that didn't fix itself. Harlan filed away what Kurt had said. In November, after the field was tilled and the equipment winterized, he called the agronomist at the co-op in Lebanon, a woman named Sandra Kellum. She had an agronomy degree from Purdue and 14 years working with growers in Boone County. She was considered the best diagnostic agronomist in the county. Sandra Kellum came out on a cold morning in the second week of November. The field was bare, post-harvest, and she walked the affected section with Harlan and dug soil samples at 6 different depths. She collected 12 samples in labeled bags. She sent them to a lab in Indianapolis. The results came back in December. Phosphorus levels low in the affected zone. pH slightly elevated compared to the rest of the field. Potassium normal. No pathogen identified in the soil samples. Sandra said the low phosphorus was contributing but was not the cause. She said the lab had found elevated salts in the affected area. She suspected irrigation runoff or a historical application issue. She recommended a lime application to adjust pH, followed by a high phosphorus starter fertilizer at planting in 1988. She also recommended a soil surfactant to address the salt accumulation. The full program she outlined would cost approximately $88 per acre in the affected area. She said there was no guarantee the issue wouldn't persist. Harlan thanked her. He sat with the recommendations for 2 weeks. He ran the numbers. $88 per acre on 31 affected rows at 60 feet wide per row. He did the math twice. He ordered the lime. The spring of 1988 was dry. Planting went in the 3rd week of April. Harlan followed Sandra's program on the affected section exactly. High phosphorus starter. Surfactant applied at 6.8 ounces per acre. He planted the northeast section with the same Pioneer brand hybrid he'd planted for 3 years, 33R88, at the same population density. The gray pallor returned in June. Slower than 1987. But it returned. By the 1st of July, 16 rows showed the early color change. By mid-July, 23 rows. Harlan drove to Lebanon and sat down with Sandra Kellum in her office. She looked at the photos he'd brought, printed from the camera his son had given him 2 Christmases before. She was quiet for a moment. She said she'd like to call in a soil scientist from Purdue to take a look. She said it was outside what she had direct experience with. The Purdue soil scientist came out in late July. His name was Dr. Thomas Ruley. He spent 4 hours in the field. He brought his own sampling equipment. He sent samples to 2 different labs. He said he'd have results in 3 to 4 weeks and would follow up. He followed up in September. He said the affected area showed signs of compaction at the 8 to 14-inch depth. A hardpan layer. He said the compaction was preventing root penetration below that depth and creating a perched water table effect in the affected zone during wet periods, followed by excessive drying during dry periods. The roots were not getting access to subsoil moisture or nutrients. The gray pallor was not a disease. It was stress. Chronic moisture stress combined with nutrient lockout from the compaction layer. He recommended deep tillage, a chisel plow run to 16 inches to break the hardpan, possibly a subsoiler pass if the chisel didn't fully fracture the layer. He said this was a common issue on fields that had been farmed intensively for many years without rotating tillage depth. He said results might not be immediate. It could take 2 to 3 seasons for the soil structure to fully recover. Harlan already ran a chisel plow on that field. Had for years. He told Ruley that. Ruley said the compaction layer might have formed below the usual chisel depth, and the solution was to go deeper. He said a chisel plow set to 12 inches wouldn't touch a hardpan at 10 inches. The math was right, but the depth was wrong. Harlan rented a subsoiler from the co-op in October 1988. He ran it through the affected section and the surrounding buffer at 18 inches. It took 2 days. The rental cost him $480. The 1988 yield from the affected section, 38 bushels per acre, better than the 31 of 1987, but still less than a third of what the rest of the field was producing. The compaction hadn't been the whole answer, or the subsoiling hadn't gone deep enough, or something else was wrong that nobody had found yet. Harlan put the 1988 numbers in the ledger book beside the 1987 numbers. He had now spent $2,400 on fungicides in 1987, $2,800 on the lime and phosphorus program in 1988, $480 on the subsoiler rental, Sandra Kellum's lab fees, $340 Narstur, Ruley's consultation, complimentary through the university extension, but 2 days of Harlan's time to host the visit. The revenue loss against expected yield across 2 seasons, $9,100. Total spent or lost on a problem nobody had solved, $15,120 by Harlan's count. He sat with that number at the kitchen table in November 1988. Helen sat across from him. He didn't read the number out loud. She didn't ask him to. She'd seen the ledger. There was a man Harlan had known about for years, but had never talked to. His name was Eldon Pruitt. He was 79 years old and had retired from farming in 1981. He'd farmed 200 acres just south of Zionsville, in the same general county soils as Harlan's ground, from 1946 to 1981. 35 years. People around the elevator said Eldon had never had a crop failure. Not once in 35 years. They also said he hadn't farmed like other people farmed. Harlan had heard stories about Eldon Pruitt over the years at the elevator. That he didn't use the standard herbicide programs. That he ran his tillage different. That he did things with his rotation that the extension office had never recommended. Most of the stories made Eldon sound like an eccentric. A man who'd gotten lucky for a long time. Harlan called him on a Wednesday morning in December 1988. Eldon Pruitt came out the following Saturday. He drove a 1974 Ford F-100 with 180,000 miles on it. He walked the field slowly. He wore rubber boots, and he stopped every 20 or 30 feet and dug into the soil with a hand probe he'd brought, an old brass-tipped thing that looked like it had been made in the 1950s. He pushed it down, pulled a core, looked at it, pushed it back in. He did this 11 times across the affected section. He didn't talk while he was doing this. Harlan walked alongside him and didn't say anything either. When Eldon was done, he stood at the edge of the field and looked back across it. He said the field was hungry in the wrong way. He said it had been fed salt so long that the biology was gone. He said the soil wasn't sick, it was dead. He said the compaction was real, but it was a symptom. The cause was 30 years of anhydrous ammonia applications and synthetic fertilizer, without anything to feed the soil biology. He said the microorganisms that were supposed to be cycling nutrients and maintaining soil structure had been suppressed. He said the field looked like it was eating itself. Harlan asked how he knew. Eldon held up one of the soil cores he'd saved in his hand. He crumbled it between his fingers, showed Harlan how it broke. Powder, not clumps, no aggregation. He said good soil broke into clusters, little crumbs with structure to them, because the fungal threads and bacterial films held particles together. This soil broke into dust. Nothing was holding it. Harlan asked what to do about it. Eldon said it took time. He said there was no product to buy that would fix it in a season. He said what the soil needed was organic matter and a biological jump start. And both of those took patience. Eldon told Harlan what he'd done on his own ground in 1952, when he'd bought a section that had been stripped for cotton by the previous owner and left with no topsoil structure to speak of. He'd seeded it to winter rye that fall, let it grow, terminated it in spring without tillage, let the roots decompose in place, applied a liquid inoculant he'd made himself from a handful of healthy soil from an old woodlot on his property, dissolved in water, sprayed across the rye stubble. Then he'd seeded his corn directly into the rye residue with a 2-row planter he'd modified to cut through the mulch. He'd done that for 3 years. By year 4, the soil had changed. He could feel it when he walked it. By year 5, it yielded 108 bushels per acre, better than anything around it. He said what Harlan needed to do was the same basic idea. Stop feeding the soil chemistry and start feeding the soil biology. Rye. Cover crops. Biological inoculant. Let the earthworms come back. Let the fungal networks reestablish. Stop tilling the affected section entirely for at least 1 season, maybe 2. Harlan asked about the inoculant. Eldon said he still had the original method written down. He said he'd copy it out for Harlan. He pulled an index card from his shirt pocket and wrote it there in the field. The recipe was simple. 1 gallon of water drawn from a moving source, not a tap. 1 large handful of soil from undisturbed ground, native prairie edge or old woodlot. 2 tablespoons of unsulfured molasses. Aerate the mixture for 24 hours with a fish tank pump. Apply within 12 hours after that. 5 gallons per acre. He handed Harlan the card. Said it didn't cost anything to try. Said it also wasn't something anybody at the extension office was going to tell him to do. Harlan spent 3 days thinking about it. Then he drove to the county line in December, to the edge of a woodlot that had been there since before the county was settled. And he dug his soil sample with a kitchen spoon. He got a fish tank pump from the pet store in Lebanon for $7. He bought a 2-pound container of unsulfured molasses at the grocery store in Jamestown for $380. He used rainwater collected in the barrel behind the barn. He mixed the inoculant in a 5-gallon bucket in the barn, the way Eldon's card described. He ran the fish tank pump for 26 hours. In December, with the field frozen, he couldn't apply it yet. He wrote the date on the bucket and waited. In late February, during a 3-day thaw, the ground in the affected section softened enough. He diluted the inoculant into 50 gallons of water in the sprayer tank and applied it to the 47 affected rows at walking pace with the nozzles close to the ground. He followed it with a broadcast seeding of winter rye at 120 pounds per acre, drilled shallow with the grain drill set to 1/2-inch depth. He didn't tell Kurt Albro what he was doing. He didn't call Sandra Kellum. He didn't contact Dr. Ruley. The rye came up in late March. He let it grow through April and into May, tall enough that he had to look over it to see the fence line. It headed out in mid-May, 28 to 31 inches tall across the section. He terminated it on May 22nd with a pass of the rotary mower set to 6 inches. Left the residue on the surface. Did not till. He waited a week. Then he planted his corn, Pioneer 3394, into the rye mulch with the 4-row planter, adding a row cleaner on the front of each unit to cut through the residue and place the seed into the soil beneath. He planted the affected section and the 20-row buffer at the same population as the rest of the field. 28,500 seeds per acre. The planting went in June 1st, 3 weeks later than the rest of the field, which had gone in May 10th. By the 3rd week of June, every row in the affected section had emerged. Stand counts on June 28th, 27,800 plants per acre. Population retention of 97.5%. The rest of the field had run at 96.8%. He told no one. By mid-July, the color was right. Not pale, not gray-white. The same deep green as the rest of the field, maybe a shade richer in the section that had been worst in 1987. The stalks were thick at the base. The ears were setting well. He pulled test ears on July 21st from 3 random locations in the affected section. Silk was fully dried. Kernels in the milk stage. Fill looked complete. He walked the section twice, counted ears per 100 stalks. 91 of 100 had ears. That was a healthy number. The year before, it had been 63. Kurt Albro came by the fence line in late July. He looked at the affected section from across the road. He didn't come onto the property. Harlan saw him standing there from the barn. Kurt stood for about 5 minutes and then drove away. The county extension newsletter that summer had an article about gray leaf spot and compaction management. Sandra Kellum had contributed to it. Harlan read it at the kitchen table. The recommendations were the same ones she'd given him in 1988. Lime, phosphorus starter, subsoiling, no mention of biological inoculants, no mention of cover crops terminated in place, no mention of what happened to the biology of soil that had been fed anhydrous ammonia for 30 years. Harlan set the newsletter on the table, drank his coffee, said nothing. Harvest came the second week of October 1989. He combined the affected section last. He kept it separate in the wagon, not mixed with the rest of the field, so he could weigh it clean. The affected section yielded 119 bushels per acre. The rest of the field yielded 114. He wrote both numbers in the ledger book. Below them, he wrote the section's yields from the previous 3 seasons. 31 in 1987, 38 in 1988, and now 119. He stared at those 3 numbers for a while. Then he wrote Eldon Pruitt's name next to the 119, the way he'd write the name of a variety or a product when he wanted to remember what had worked. He drove to Zionsville and knocked on Eldon Pruitt's door in late October. Eldon answered in a canvas coat. Harlan showed him the yield slip from the grain elevator. Eldon looked at it, handed it back, said that was about right. Harlan asked if Eldon had ever written any of his methods down. Eldon said not really. A few index cards. Harlan asked if he'd be willing to sit down and talk through them at some length. Eldon said he had time. They met 6 times over the winter of 1989 and 1990. Harlan brought a notebook. He wrote down everything Eldon said. The cover crop sequences, the inoculant recipe variations, the tillage timing Eldon had developed through trial across different soil types, the rotation patterns, why Eldon had started doing what he'd done in 1952 and what he'd learned in each decade since. Harlan applied the inoculant and rye rotation to the full 140 acres in 1990. Not just the affected section, the entire farm. He ran the system for 5 years, 1989 through 1993. The results in his ledger: 1990, 122 bushels per acre field average. 1991, 126. 1992, 118, a drought year. County average dropped to 94. 1993, 131. During the 1992 drought, when Boone County averaged 94 bushels per acre and the co-op was full of growers with disaster insurance claims, Harlan's 118 was the highest reported yield in his township. He didn't advertise it. He heard about it secondhand from Helen, who'd heard it at the library. Kurt Albro came over in the fall of 1992. He said he'd been watching Harlan's fields all summer. He said he didn't understand how Harlan had held yields during the drought when everyone else had collapsed. He said his own ground had come in at 79 bushels per acre, and he'd been thinking about that number since August. Harlan told him about Eldon Pruitt. He told him about the inoculant and the rye and the decision to stop tilling the affected section for the first year. He didn't mention the $15,000 he'd spent chasing answers that didn't work. That wasn't Kurt's business. Kurt asked if he could come back and talk more. Harlan said he could. 3 other farmers from the county came by the following winter, asking similar questions. Harlan sat with each of them at the kitchen table, showed them the ledger, gave each one an index card with the inoculant recipe, copied from the one Eldon had written in the field in 1988. He told each of them the same thing. It wouldn't cost more than $15 in materials to try, and it would take 2 full seasons before they knew if it was working. So they needed patience. Sandra Kellum called him in the spring of 1993. She said she'd heard from some growers she worked with that Harlan had been doing something different with his soil program. She said she was curious. She asked if she could come out. She came on a Thursday afternoon in May. She walked the field. She looked at the soil profiles he dug for her with the hand probe. She looked at the earthworm counts in each core. She said she hadn't seen aggregation like that in a conventionally farmed field before. She asked a lot of questions. She took notes. She didn't say that the Extension Service had been wrong. She didn't say that the fungicide applications and the subsoiling and the phosphorus program had been the wrong answer. She asked if Harlan would be willing to be part of a Purdue on-farm trial looking at cover crop biology. Harlan said he'd think about it. He thought about it for a week. He called Eldon Pruitt to ask what he thought. Eldon said to do what seemed right to him. Eldon said he himself had never had much use for trials. Harlan declined the trial. He told Sandra Kellum he wasn't interested in being studied. He said what he was doing worked, and he'd rather keep doing it than put it through a process. She said she understood. Eldon Pruitt died in January 1996 at age 86. Harlan drove to the funeral in Zionsville. He sat in the 3rd row with his hat in his lap. He didn't speak at the service. Eldon hadn't had many close friends, from what Harlan could see. The room had about 30 people in it. Harlan kept the index card Eldon had written in the field in December 1988. He kept it in the kitchen drawer, folded once. He referred to it every February when he made the inoculant batch. The card was soft with handling by then. The ink faded to gray, but still readable. He used the method on the same 140 acres in Boone County until he retired in 2004. 17 seasons after 1987. His average yield over those 17 seasons, 121 bushels per acre. Boone County average over the same period, 107. The northeast corner section that had run at 31 bushels per acre in 1987 ran at 124 in 2003, his final full crop year. He wrote that number in the ledger book too on the last page and drew a line under it. His son took over the farm in 2004. He kept the rye rotation for 4 years, then shifted to a commercial cover crop mix from the co-op that was easier to source and fit better with his planting schedule. The yield stayed strong for a few years. Then they began softening. By 2011, the son was running 108 to 112 per acre. Still not bad, but not what they'd been. Harlan heard about the numbers from Helen, who still talked to the neighbors. He didn't offer his opinion on what had changed. It wasn't his farm anymore. The index card with Eldon Pruitt's inoculant recipe is still in the kitchen drawer of the farmhouse in Boone County. Harlan put it there in 1988, and it hasn't moved. The current owner knows it's there, has read it, hasn't used it yet. The recipe is 5 lines long. Total cost of the materials, $10.80 in 1988 dollars. Less now if you know where to find the soil. Still works, always did.